I'd like to welcome you to our afternoon of Irish Studies, and thank you for taking the time to participate. I suppose these past few months have been anything but easy for most of us, and I'm aware that the Irish community, and indeed any migrant community, is faced with a lack of opportunities to see family, to see friends face to face. And that's why I'm particularly delighted to welcome you. I know it's on screen. It's not quite the same as us all gathering in the embassy. That was our original plan. That's what we wanted to do today, to have a more interactive engagement. But unfortunately, that's not. So I do thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Just to mention as an aside, the embassy has stayed open throughout the pandemic to offer consular support, in particular to the Irish community. And we started to host some events recently, albeit they're all virtual. We did one physical one about 2 weeks ago outside in a courtyard, but given current developments, certainly I think we're sticking with virtual for the time being anyway. Today, I suppose we've invited you to an online afternoon of Irish Studies, and there's two very interesting lectures on different areas of Irish Studies given by two renowned academics. We have Professor Joachim Schwent, and he'll talk about memory culture and identity construction in contemporary Ireland, while Professor Dr. Catherine Toal will explore literary portrayals of growing up in Ireland. We're very proud that we have an impressive number of Irish, German, and international academics based in Germany who are in our audience today. It's probably fair to say, as an academic discipline, Irish studies thrived in Germany throughout the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s. The two main centres, the University of Wuppertal, led by Heinz Kozak, or Okozak, as he was often referred to back then, and at the University of Mainz, led by Klaus Lubers. Elsewhere in Germany, Irish studies was often interchangeable with Celtic studies. Even though popular interest in academic research into the studies has increased since then, I suppose unfortunately since the beginning of this century, many of the centres, the programmes, the chairs that constituted the core of Celtic and Irish studies, sadly some disappeared and the teaching of Irish studies declined. Recently though, however, we're delighted there's been an upswing in Irish studies in Germany again, mainly thanks to the efforts of many of those present today. There's still scope for raising the profile even more, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has identified this as an ambition for the embassy here in our 2018 review of German-Irish relations. And that's why the embassy is involved in exploring possibilities for furthering Irish studies in Germany. And this afternoon's conference indeed is one of those starting points. With this in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our two distinguished speakers this afternoon, both who have been at the forefront of Irish studies in Germany. Firstly, we have Professor Joachim Schwent, who studied at the Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz and Ealing College, London. From October 1987 to March 1988, he was based at the National Institute for Higher Education, which is now known as Dublin City University, where he was an exchange lecturer at the School of Applied Languages, teaching courses in German literature and translation of German texts. He was then a senior lecturer and later full professor for British Cultural Studies at Universität Leipzig, from which he retired in 2015. His publications focused on Scottish and Irish literature and culture, as well as the contemporary discussions of constitutionalism and regionalism in the UK. And secondly, then, we'll hear from Professor Dr. Catherine Toal, who's Professor of Literature and Dean of the Faculty at Bard College, Berlin. She's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and Harvard University, and was a research fellow at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Her interests are in the area of 19th to 20th century and contemporary literature and the history of literary theory. At the end of both lectures, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, Professor Schwend, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ireland, Dr. Nicholas O'Brien, and to Dr. Melanie Neumann. I think in a time of worldwide rising nationalism and ethnic prejudices, our collective memories and their use in the political discourse gain relevance. Consequently, it's all the more important to create an awareness of how national and regional identities are constructed with the help of commemoration. I would like to start with a quote by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, in a speech given on the 4th of July 2019 in Leipzig University. He argued, creating the new in the shadow of the past, building for the future while recognizing all that has gone before, and using the materials available in present time is a challenge well known and well understood in Leipzig. And he continues, we have to consider how decisions fail to echo, or are dissonant on the European street. Following the concepts of Hayden White, I would like to define history as a narrative prose discourse, a followable story. We start from an unprocessed historical record and deliver an organized story, which is guided by specific motives. Hayden White uses the term of implotment to describe how the story is told and in what form of a plot it is presented, and what ideological implications are inherent in the story as it is told. Historiography is, of course, not the same as commemorations, whose symbols are linked to a community. Maurice Halbwach's basic maxim is that there are as many collective memories as there are collectives. Communities differ, often quite substantially, in the general use they make of one and the same past event, and consequently different collectives have different stories to tell about the same historic event. For Pianora, memory remains in permanent evolution and is vulnerable to manipulation. In contrast, history, because it is an intellectual and secular production, calls for analysis and criticism. Think, for instance, of the 1968 generation, or now the anti-slavery movement, Black Lives Matter, and the destruction of commemorative sites, statues of Columbus, King Leopold II of Belgium, the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol Harbor, even Churchill's statue in Parliament Square was sprayed with the slogan racist. Or another example, Donald Trump calls for teaching a patriotic history, not fake history. Whatever he decides fake history may be, or patriotic history may be. Whether he actually called fallen American soldiers on American war cemeteries in France losers and suckers is not so important. More important is the implication of having made such a statement. We must differentiate between historiography based on facts, and I do not mean alternative facts, and collective remembering. The latter has an agenda, particular goals, but no explicit standards. I would like to quote again President Higgins in a speech in the Mansion on 28th March 2016, the speech on remembering, in which he talks of the, quote, complicated relationship between the act of commemoration and the discipline of history. History and commemoration operate, of course, on different registers. Commemoration inevitably involves the selection of events, actors, ideas, and consequences, and it requires a dialectic between remembering and forgetting that tends to be mediated through the prism of contemporary concerns, unquote. Collective remembering begins with the assumption that a memory community is built around a shared set of textual means, and these text-based narratives include pictures, symbols, by now also social media. What makes memory collective is the fact that members of a group share more or less the same narrative resources. The resources from which the resources form a textual community. The exhibition on the work of Avi Warburg in Haus der Kulturen in Berlin is a perfect example for this approach. In a discourse about commemoration and nationalism, the Irish language is, of course, of relevance. It is frequently used both by President Higgins and Gerry Adams in their speeches to commemorate the 1916 Rising. Michael D. Higgins speaks of a European street on which we, hopefully, travel. European values could also reduce the influence of nationalism and, above all, ethnicity-based differentiation between nations. Let me quote Immanuel Kant here on Enlightenment. Aufklärung ist der Ausgang des Menschen aus seiner selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit. Unmündigkeit ist das Unvermögen, sich seines Verstandes ohne Leitung eines anderen zu bedienen. Habe Mut, dich deines eigenen Verstandes zu bedienen. These are central demands in creating an enlightened identity, which stands in stark contrast to purpose-oriented and politically influenced constructions used for political goals. As President Higgins argued, yes, it is important that we refrain from any simplistic judgment, whether apologetic or condemning. It is important that we endeavor to do justice to the motivations of the actors of the time and to the manner in which they judged or were induced to seize the opportunities afforded. President Higgins wants the rising to be seen within its global and European contexts. Therefore, I would like to give a few examples of public speeches in connection with the 100th anniversary of the East Rising in 2016 to demonstrate what I try to delineate above, remembering historical facts and making suggestions for future actions considering the ideals of the proclamation. President Higgins asked in a speech on remembering, how then to remember 1916? A good start to the commemoration of 1916 Easter Rising is, of course, the poem by William Butler Yeats. Fintan O'Toole argues in The Guardian, the past is wildly unpredictable. He sees the rising as a, quote, foundational event for three political entities, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the current United Kingdom, which changed radically when most of Ireland won its independence, unquote. He continues with a question, quote, the struggle has always been to decide whether it is history or current affairs, something that has happened or a harbinger of something yet to happen, done and dusted or unfinished business, unquote. This puts it nicely that history and commemoration is something which refers to the present and maybe points towards the future. Only recently has the Northern Ireland problem and a threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom come to the center of political discussions in Europe. The 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising climaxed in a grand parade past the General Post Office in O'Connell Street, Dublin, involving thousands of soldiers as well as 4,000 descendants of armed idealists. Wesley Boyd, former head of news at RTE, compares in the Irish Times the Irish politicians on the reviewing stand with mini Stalins at an October parade in Red Square. Boyd's quintessence is that the rising continues to be divisive. Significantly, Boyd refers to Theobald Wolff Cohen and his idea of a united Ireland without regard to religion. The logo of the United Irishmen clearly links it to the French Revolution. Higgins argues that early 20th century Ireland was a complex place, but, and this is decisive, the Irish in those days were able to differ with dignity and respect for each other's views. This mentality to differ with dignity and respect seems to have got lost recently, especially in the social media discourses. And Higgins says something which is perfectly into the subject of this paper. Tonight we celebrate not only our rich cultural heritage, but also its contemporary expression, our new imaginings, and the many creative ways in which we are telling our stories. For ours is a story still in the making. And he continues, the Republic, the signatories envisaged in the proclamation, is ours to achieve. Together we have the power to realize the possibility of an inclusive future in which we share our Republic and its opportunities with all who belong to her, both here and abroad. And he brings European values into the discussion. Quote, the signatories understood the spirit and meaning of what was a republic in the sense of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution. Or to put it differently, again in Higgins's words, the challenge of remembering ethically. This challenge has to be accepted and taken up. This implies, quote, an openness to the dissonant voices and stories of the other. The stranger, the enemy of yesterday, the importance of avoiding any false or comforting amnesia. Ethical remembering, as Higgins continues, must be based on historical empiricism. It must respect context and complexity, as well as the agency and the integrity of the motivations of the men and women from the past. President Higgins tells a followable story in all the speeches he gave in this anniversary. He tells a followable story about an Irish nationalism with an emphasis on equality and emancipation, an Irish identity which is never fixed once and for all, but will continue to develop with influences from at home and from the whole Irish diaspora. In his speech to the Mansion House, he warns there's always a risk then that commemoration might be exploited for partisan purposes. This is what Gerry Adams does in his speech in Belfast. He refers right at the beginning to the proclamation and to our patriot dead, and goes on to the centuries of colonization and injustice. The men and women of 1916 fought against Adams an empire built on conquest, exploitation, brute force, and repression. Gerry Adams sees Sinn Féin's core values of equality, liberty, and fraternity, which are, of course, the values of the French Revolution, and which takes us once again to the European Enlightenment. Gerry Adams also mentions the role of women in the Rising. So does Higgins, by the way. He gave a special speech on the role of women in the Rising. Adams says, "So we salute all our sisters in struggle," unquote. Adam goes on to talk about developments in the two Irish communities and the injustices perpetrated by Unionists in the North, injustices imposed and protected by British guns. Adams' speech is much more political and much less conciliatory in the Republic, and the Republic, as propagated in 1916, is, according to him, not yet established. But instead, the winners are, quote, the church hierarchy, the media, and big business, unquote. Ireland's culture minister then, Heather Humphreys, also has an inclusive approach and told the Observer, "As someone who grew up and still lives beside the border, I'm very aware of the sensitivities that still exist. Through Ireland 2016, we are extending an invitation to all of the people on this island to join with us as we remember the events of 100 years ago." Consequently, she also refers to the casualties of the 36th Ulster Division at the Somme. Fintan O'Toole, who is well known for not mincing words, argued that the Rising was, quote, staged by a minority of a minority, unquote. Higgins puts anti-imperialist thinking in connection with the cultural awakening in Ireland and argues the Rising is concerned with the elevation of the Irish people, long considered a rabble to the status of a nation, unquote. Whereby, and here we can refer to Higgins' speech in Leipzig again, nation is for Higgins not the 19th century concept, but rather something which is invigorated by the, quote, guiding principle of the European Union, solidarity between our nations and solidarity with others. John Bruton, Fine Gael politician, former Taoiseach, also refers to Ireland as part of Europe. He says, this state is a rule of law-based parliamentary democracy, which has integrated itself with its European neighbors by peaceful negotiation and compromise. Bruton sees the obligation of those responsible for all the celebrations to think about what and why to celebrate. Quote, given that one of the purposes of education is to pass on a moral sense to the next generation, it is vitally important that the morality of the decision to initiate killing and dying in 1916 be examined by and for these school children, unquote. Bruton argues, we study history partly to learn lessons that are valuable to us in the future, so that, drawing on past experience, we can better weigh up in the most informed way possible in light of evidence from the past what is right and what is wrong for the future. Rudin criticizes the idea that the proclamation represents the core values of our state and calls instead for compromise as a necessary part of democratic politics. In contrast to the eulogies on the Rising and the proclamation, Rudin sees the real heroes among the Irish Parliamentary Party. People like Redmond and Dillon who worked hard to achieve the possible, which was Home Rule in those days. Home Rule was the dominion status which Australia and Canada already had, nations which acquired full independence in a peaceful way within the empire and then the Commonwealth of Nations. To listen also to someone outside the Irish bubble, I should like to refer to Teresa Villiers, Conservative MP and Secretary of State for Northern Ireland from 2012 to 2016. She obviously puts the emphasis more on the points of view of unionists in time of World War I and the Battle at the Somme in France. She talks of the, quote, revered status, unquote, of the men and women in the Rising, a status bordering on the mythological, while those Irish men and women who fought in France at the Somme were largely disregarded, as Villiers states. Teresa Villiers talks also of the complexities of the period. As a woman, it makes sense that she also talks about the women who had taken an active part, both on the side of the insurrection, but also on the unionist side. And she makes a statement which raises hopes for the future handling of the whole matter. The governments of the United Kingdom and Ireland have been working together to put historical accuracy and mutual respect for different views at the heart of our approach to this decade of centenaries. And she adds, both administrations were determined to prevent the centenaries being hijacked by those who might use them to reopen the wounds of the past and to promote discord, unquote. She congratulates the Irish administration on the commemoration of the, quote, still sensitive and contested event in ways that are both dignified and inclusive. Higgins, in all his speeches, pleads for a comprehensive remembering in a wider context. After all, 485 men, women, and children died in Dublin in Easter week, the vast majority of them civilians, caught in crossfire and British shelling. But 580 Irishmen were killed on the Western Front in the same week. Higgins propagates the idea of inclusivity with all those who took part in the Rising and should be remembered. Quote, the key actors in the Rising were not abstract or mythical figures. They were living and particularly conscious and engaged men and women. They were poets, academics, journalists, and civil servants, city clerks and shopkeepers, rural farmers and laborers, Catholics and Protestants, whose voices made the call for a new reimagined Ireland. And he continues, we have a duty to honor and to respect that past and to retrieve the idealism which was at its heart. But we have a greater duty to imagine and to forge a future illuminated by the unfulfilled promises of our past. Let us revive the best of the promise of 1916 so that those coming generations might experience freedom in the full sense of the term. Freedom from poverty, freedom from violence and insecurity, freedom from fear. In conclusion, to come back to the speech in Leipzig about a year ago, I should like to quote one more sentence from Higgins, which sounds all the more relevant today when we see the rising nationalism and ethnocentricity of our times. Higgins propagates a European conversation that is widely diverse and inclusive. So what can you make from all this, from an interdisciplinary cultural studies point of view? The Rising is a historical fact, but it is much more. It is by now an important part of Irish and European imagination, and as such, it is open to interpretations, and these change in the course of time, and it can show us which values should be supreme in our world. Higgins sees the commemoration as, quote, an invitation to pay full attention to the fundamental moral questions that still confront us in our own times, unquote. Democracy is, as Higgins said, a work in progress, and commemoration can teach us something about the human dignity of those who were the victims of a brutal world order. All this could be condensed into the ideals of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the American Revolution, as Higgins said in one of his speeches. And I would like to finish with President Higgins' concluding words in English in his speech in Leipzig. There are the very last concluding words in Irish, which I'm too stupid to pronounce. But in English, he said, quote, this Europe we seek must be one in which such hateful squabbles are replaced with openness, inclusivity, cohesion, solidarity, and the recognition that the shift to a new gendered, ecological, social paradigm of wealth creation and distribution is pursued together and without delay. Thank you very much.
Back to this afterwards. So let me invite Professor Toal, please, at this point.
Hi, thank you very much to the ambassador and to Melanie Neumann and all your colleagues at the embassy for organizing the meetings today, especially in this very challenging situation. I think we'll all feel a certain amount of nostalgia, even for the material I'm talking about that was published only last year, because the Irish novel of the future is going to be partly about growing up on Zoom. So here goes. There's always been a strange relationship between literature and society in modern Ireland. In the longer history of Irish culture, we see the destruction of the patronage arrangements that supported the production of literature in Gaelic civilization, and the first Irish writing in English being produced by the Anglo-Irish colonizer class. After the emergence of the Irish Free State in 1922, a certain hostility develops between literary innovation and the state, with the establishment of a Committee on Evil Literature and the first of a series of censorship of publications acts. Even if censorship didn't actually manage to prevent the circulation of banned works, it reflected an important feature of Irish society, namely the immense influence of the Catholic Church. Both the repressiveness of that influence and the economic struggles of the state perpetuated another anomalous relationship between Ireland and its writers: exile. In Northern Ireland, which continues to experience a very high level of migration from among its younger population, literary works had to grapple with the existence of two societies in one: the Protestant Unionist-controlled state and the Catholic minority, which partly boycotted the institutions of that state and was also systematically discriminated against by them. A few years ago, from about 2015, a new renaissance in Irish literature began to be heralded, one characterized for the first time by an equal prominence of male and female writers, homegrown publishing, and a renewed radicalism of form. This development is observable north and south, and the possibilities of exchange between writers from all parts of Ireland have never been greater. The background, if not the cause of the phenomenon, is at least threefold. After the demise of the so-called Celtic Tiger economy, whose paw prints are tracked in a number of recent novels, a public esteem for literary vocation that had been evident from the 1960s through the 1980s seemed to reappear. The peace process in Northern Ireland had slowly rendered the division between the two parts of the country impalpable for many practical purposes, and strengthened impartial frameworks of support for the arts in the north. In the south, long-standing campaigns for social liberalization moved toward the achievement of important results, with an amendment to the Constitution in 2015 permitting same-sex marriage, and the repeal in 2018 of a provision from 1983, which had committed the state to vindicating and defending the life of the unborn. Of course, in Irish literary history, there's a certain suspicion surrounding the idea of revivals. In the works of Irish modernism by James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, we see an often mocking response to the Anglo-Irish literary revival of the 19th century. A recent article about today's young Irish novelists by Colm Tóibín noted that the 1970s seemed to him and his generation an era of creativity and freedom, in which there was no need anymore to think about nationalism or religion. The idea of the Irish Free State as a repressive entity also ignores the numerous instances of literary creativity and collaboration that flourished within its confines. A sense of the current openness and vibrancy in the Northern Ireland art scene shouldn't block out the achievements of both realist and experimental writers from the 1930s onwards, who recorded but also transcended the conflicts to which they were witness. As the scholarly and cultural work that has been done to restore the legacy of literature by Irish women shows, the previous lack of gender parity is partly the result of various forms of suppression. Fashion also tends to drown out even recent voices in favor of brand new ones. One question that literary scholars will want to ask is how and to what extent this current moment in Irish literature deals with past motifs, and how it addresses in its languages and shape the changes and upheavals that have taken place in Irish society since the 1980s. The theme of growing up offers a way into this issue, and not only in regard to narrative, which is my focus here. In German, the novel of growing up has a name, the Bildungsroman, or novel of education. According to theorists of this genre, the Bildungsroman seeks to bring about a reconciliation after a period of conflict between the hero and his or her society. The historian Claire Wills recently summarized the plot of the 20th century Irish novel as follows. The young are at risk from the brutality of their elders, who are in league with the institutions of power. There doesn't seem much scope for reconciliation here. Wills contrasts two kinds of ending: the escape abroad of Joyce's Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and the conclusion of Edna O'Brien's novel, A Pagan Place, from 1970, in which the heroine locks herself up in a convent. Wills sees a repeat of this motif of feminine self-sacrifice in the tragic finale of a more recent novel, Emer McBride's A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, published in 2013 and set in the Ireland of the 1980s. Although the institutions condemned by Joyce and O'Brien are no longer so overtly powerful in McBride's book, she suggests the damaging residue of the sorts of dogma, impunity, and secrecy associated with them. Her style is also a marriage between the two predecessor authors, creating a syntax out of impressions that is applied mainly to the intimacy of relationships. McBride draws on the motif of escape or exile as well, since her two later novels, The Lesser Bohemians from 2016 and Strange Hotel, published earlier this year, are told from this perspective. The consequences of the influence of Catholicism on Irish life will probably be literary inspirations for some time to come, even though there's a danger, as with all of the familiar Irish tropes, of a reversion to cliches of victimhood. In Northern Irish literature, the process of getting to grips with the past must still involve facing the legacy of the Troubles. One of the most acclaimed of recent works, Anna Burns' Milkman, published in 2018, was greeted as a perfect synthesis of the condition of stasis that existed at the height of that conflict. Burns elaborated a parallel language to express both the comic absurdity and the imprisoning quality of the codes people use to negotiate a polarized society. She arrived at this achievement through the genre of the Bildungsroman. Her novel No Bones from the year 2001 is a classic example of this form, telling the story of a girl growing up in Northern Ireland in a chronological scheme that corresponds to the unfolding and resolution of the conflict there. The Troubles started on a Thursday, the narrator tells us. It includes failed and also farcical versions of the motif of escape. The main character leaves for England, where she has a breakdown. Toward the novel's end, she and her friends flee in a chaotic excursion to another island, Rathlin, off the northeast coast. Milkman combines this largely tragic narrative with Burns's comic novel, Little Constructions from 2007, which creates a parody of Republican gang warfare and ideology. The stasis that defined the Troubles in the late 1970s and early 80s is conveyed through the fixed position of Milkman's main character. We learn little about her own past or her likely futures. The stages of growing up are evoked through her group of wee sisters and her older siblings. Young people or children who might not have a future are also a concern for a writer from a Protestant background, Jan Carson, in her novels Malcolm Orange Disappears from 2014 and The Firestarters from 2019. Carson uses magical or supernatural elements to suggest a redemptive potential, but also to bring out the horror of the real and the relief of a possible return to ordinariness. Like one of the writers she credits with making her own work possible, Glenn Patterson, she's very aware of the surreal way in which Northern Ireland has become a set of stock images and references also to itself. Alongside its specific preoccupations, recent Irish literature takes part in international trends, such as the resurgence of autobiographical writing. Aspects of this address the experience of growing up in 1980s Ireland. For example, Emily Pine's record of the impact on her family of the constitutional ban on divorce in effect until 1996 in Notes to Self from 2018. Similarly, Sinead Gleason's Constellations from 2019 generates a resonance between her childhood ordeals of illness and the kind of power enshrined by the recently repealed Eighth Amendment. However, though both books are testimonies to the process of liberalization, they are in part a response to cross-cultural narratives about the body. They indicate the effect on writing and on experience of the fact that the society we live in is not just transnational, but a virtual network. In contrast, their most important forerunner, Nuala Whelan's Are You Somebody from 1996, conveys a picture of Irish society in the 1960s and 70s. Nevertheless, current Irish memoir, when we compare works by men with those of women writers, shows a version of the old opposition noticed by Claire Wills between escape and self-sacrifice. The autobiographical essays of Kevin Brannock's Tunnel Vision from 2019 and Rob Doyle's pastiche memoir, Threshold, published this year, are exhibitions of youthful dissolution and idiosyncratic rifts that continually provoke the question of whether they are worth anything, while their female contemporaries take on the responsibility of providing a social commentary. In fiction, a number of the most stunning works of the last few years show a concern with the prospects of rural communities and with masculine identity. Colin Barrett's acclaimed short story collection, Young Skins from 2013, seems beset by the question of whether it is possible to grow up in Ireland. A lost or endangered child always lurks somewhere in these tales of young men facing a dead end who get caught up in a game-changing act of violence. What remains alive throughout is a language that connects the body of the male protagonist to the landscape and to the other characters, whom he recognizes or knows so well that he can animate and dismantle them in description. Depictions of collective interaction show long ago tendencies in new guises. This week, the Irish Times correspondent in Berlin, Derek Scally, lauded the neighborly solidarity manifest in Ireland during the pandemic, but also noted an impulse toward anxiety and shaming that he felt was relatively absent in Germany. He cited the paradigmatic Irish novel of community surveillance, Brinsley McNamara's The Valley of the Squinting Windows from 1918. Younger Irish novelists seem to agree that shame-based attempts at social control have persisted even after the decline of religious orthodoxy. The point is ironically summed up by Nisha Dolan's brilliantly constructed novel, Exciting Times, published this year, when the narrator recalls her hurt at seeing the yes equality social media profile pictures of girls who had subjected her to homophobic bullying in school. They call themselves allies now, the narrator says. Difficulties with peers is also a powerful subject in the novel that has been most successful in rendering an Irish context for international reception, Sally Rooney's Normal People from 2018. Dolan's and especially Rooney's novels have attracted critical commentary on the way the characters debate, inwardly or in conversations and virtual exchanges, political stances and opinions. Except in reference to the act of voting, contemporary Irish politics is hardly mentioned, but the scrutiny the characters undergo regarding their political beliefs has almost the quality of a comedic religious examination. Since Ireland became a Migrationsgesellschaft, or in its case, a country to which people migrate rather than one that they leave, Irish studies has turned to the question of the experience of migrants. Here, as elsewhere, pre-existing narratives exert their influence. The teller of Arya Kayarmo's short story, Alienation, unable to get a residence permit, supports her two children by writing a witty, anonymous column for a Dublin newspaper about the life of a foreigner in Ireland, and by syndicating romantic little vignettes about the country to European magazines. In this light, her very funny observations about the particular way in which Irish society can practice exclusion also appear designed to divert an audience content to treat as foibles what for the narrator are highly consequential obstacles. An issue of audience expectation, though bearing on an ordeal of a different degree, appears in Melatu Uche Okore's This Hostile Life, about the infantilization imposed by the direct provision asylum system, when the narrator is told that she needs to make her writing about attitudes to racial difference in Ireland more positive. Current Irish literature includes stories of growing up elsewhere than in the traditional destinations of emigration. The anthology, The Art of the Glimpse, published this month, which offers a wonderful introduction to Irish fiction, includes a story called Dishonoring the Dead by the Nigerian-born poet Chiamaka Enyi Amadi, where the narrator rejects the debate over ownership, identity, legitimacy conducted at her parents' funeral to fashion a tribute to them. In conclusion, one of the challenges of Irish studies is always to confront the pressure of the stories that have already been told while encountering the literary text as it is. Thank you.